Okay, so hopefully I think we can start now. So today we're going to be talking about implementation process for OpenCRVS projects. And Markus is here, our technical lead for OpenCRVS, and Markus is relatively new to the OpenCRVS team and is interested to learn about our kind of general approach. So I'm going to be talking about the different sorts of projects that we run and the kind of more practical aspects of how we actually work when we're working on these projects, particularly of interest to you, Markus, because you're just starting a project with Madagascar for implementation of OpenCRVS. So you might have a lot of questions as we're talking through this. Please ask a question whenever you want to, Markus. Just interrupt me and ask the question. So I'm going to share a screen and show a few things. So hopefully you can see my screen. So this is a slide which talks about the sorts of flow that the kind of flow that we do when we're working with countries, and generally the length of time associated with different sorts of OpenCRVS project. So the first type of project I want to talk about is a proof of concept. So we call this a POC. And what this is it's an opportunity for a country to try OpenCRVS, but only capturing fake data, so not real citizen data. And a proof of concept project, usually we host it for the country because there may not be infrastructure available, and we can host it in the cloud. So we host it in our digital droplets, because we're not going to be storing any citizen data, so it doesn't matter where this is hosted. And it normally takes about 8 weeks to run this kind of project. What we do is we gather inputs from the country, and the inputs I'll be talking about in a moment. They will be generally Excel sheets where we ask the country to write down what sort of questions they'd like to ask for birth registration or death registration. Usually we do a POC with one type of vital event because we're trying to do this quickly. We're not going to do all the vital events for proof of concept. We're just going to do, let's just do birth registration, or let's just do birth and death registration. And we can design the form and the certificates based on our usual defaults for our kind of example countries, even if the laws and regulations in a country may say that such a certificate isn't yet allowed by their laws. We can use a POC to test new ways of working and innovative civil registration process using OpenCRVS. So we configure OpenCRVS with to the ideal scenario of what we would like to do one day with birth registration in a country. And then we can we install it on DigitalOcean, we quality assure it in a light way, a smoke test really, and then we immediately get it into a field testing scenario. So we'll do some light training for civil registrars in a particular district, and they can use it for a few weeks alongside their normal day-to-day process. So they'll be registering real citizens in their existing systems, be they legacy digital systems or paper-based, And alongside that, imagining what it would be like to use this example system to register people with different names, fake dates of birth, etc. And the staff can then feed back at the end to say, oh, that was great, or we'd like to make some changes to OpenCRVS and we need some requirements. So that's where we kind of see the proof of concept review leads on to what we call a pilot, or a pilot implementation. This is where we actually now have a much longer project, usually with funding. Like we tend to do proof of concepts for free. And then when we move towards pilot and implementation, we would speak to a donor to get them to pay some money for our time to help for 6 months to scope everything out and install, give the country really good hands-on technical training, as you are now doing in Madagascar, to actually configure real servers and prepare to capture real citizen data. And so in order to do that, we probably need to make a lot of design changes, form configuration changes to conform with the law in that country as it is right now, which is exactly what's happening in your project right now. And the servers can no longer be cloud hosted. They have to be in country because we're going to be capturing citizen data. Now, so we design and build additional requirements, and we do a lot of change management. So this is where we're actually now officially having to run training sessions with, say, large groups of civil registrars in a pilot district. Like maybe they might want to, because it's very difficult for a country to just adopt a new digital solution at scale. Naturally, this change management process changes that have to happen, and that takes time. So what we advise is that a country might start a pilot implementation in 2 or 3 districts of a country, train those staff, start registering OpenCRVS for real in these districts for some time until those staff are comfortable using it, and they have the capacity to train other districts. So essentially, we're getting a group of OpenCRVS heroes who can then disseminate the knowledge and gradually scale up the system over time. And the scale up over time is really just about change management and perhaps adding extra servers in a cluster for load balancing, or increasing the hard disk size to cope with more registrations, etc., for national scale. So these are the sorts of projects that we run currently. So if I just come out of this slide, do you have any questions about these types of projects before I go on to talk about the actual inputs and go into more practicalities?
Yeah, sure. So kind of clarifying, moving from proof of concept to pilot. So do we then involve we have these system roles. So depending on, are you kind of field agent or are you the national system admin, for example? So how are all of those roles involved from the beginning already, or how do we scope them out?
Yes, that's very much part of the inputs, that we scope them out right at the beginning. Of course, we learn more throughout proof of concept and pilot that may mean we need to go back and edit those roles. But we try to make it exhaustive from the beginning, that the roles exist in the system. Like we might call, so we have a system role, that's our internal name for a role, like as you said, a field agent, a registration agent, a registrar. And the country will obviously not use those terms. They'll have their own organizational terms, and that is the actual public role of the user, which will map to a system role, a set of permissions that OpenCRVS understands. And very much we're trying to get that right from the beginning, so that the country can test OpenCRVS in the best way that it can for change management to be simple and straightforward.
I see. Thanks.
So if I just come out of this slide right now, and we look at this page in our documentation called Gather Requirements. So this page contains all the information that is needed in order to do the inputs to any OpenCRVS project. So we can see that there are 5 sections in here that talk about understanding what the current business processes are for civil registration in a country. Now, most of the time, the basic requirements of declaration, validation, registration, certification are universal, because most of the time, the high-level requirements are generic for every country. There are some differences between Anglophone and Francophone ways of doing things, but other than that, the rest of the world tends to adopt one of either Anglophone or Francophone approaches to civil registration in the civil registration industry. So there are minor differences between them. And then, of course, there are sometimes every country has something unique that it does, be that, for example, in Philippines, where there's decentralized models, such as people can only register within their own part of the country. You can't register a birth unless you're actually physically in that location. That's a commonality. Now, so for those sorts of country-specific requirements, there are ways in which these can be additionally configured in OpenCRVS. So what we're doing with mapping business processes is trying to understand more about the country. Is it more Anglophone? Is it more Francophone? And what are the edge cases in the process that we need to cater for? And how do we make sure we configure them in settings? We'll also be asking the country to complete exactly what we've just been talking about. What are the names of the roles? What are the usual permissions? And how do they map to system roles and permissions within the software? Helping the country to make that connection, so that we know what types of users we need to create and what sorts of permissions they'll need, and if any customizations are required, and if there are, having those issues in our backlog for future versions. If there's any case that we discover where there's a business process or an application setting that we don't currently support, that's in our, then we would work with the country to help them have a transition period where perhaps during pilot, they can take OpenCRVS as it is and make do with what we have currently in order to get moving, with the understanding that scale up will require upgrading to a new version when capabilities are available. So then it would be working with the country to make these issues and working with their technical teams to develop them together in such a way that we can put them into core and they'll be available for the rest of the world to use. And you can see, so we ask the country to tell us about what sort of form validations do they need based on their phone number formats or national ID number formats, or and whatever kind of identification supporting documentation they need, what is the cost of registration. It's always slightly different in different countries within certain time periods. And of course, configuring the forms to use the right questions, ask the right questions that are required by law in the country. There'll be many fields which are mandatory from an OpenCRVS perspective and cannot be modified, such as names, dates of birth. Our approach to that cannot be modified because we understand and have standardized those fields with international standards so that they will interoperate with other systems. Often this is something which countries don't appreciate. They may not have had experience with interoperability to understand that standardization around some fields is really important to make interoperability between a civil registration system and a health system, or a civil registration system and a national ID system an easy process. If there is custom approaches to generic fields like names, dates of birth within for each system, and then suddenly they no longer interoperate, and we must standardize those sorts of things. So that's often a bit of an education process we have to do with usually the non-technical staff in a country who might say, I want to change the first name field to be like this, or the last name field to be like that. And we have to explain that you can add as many custom fields as you like, but there are some mandatory fields that are needed and that you can't customize. And if you do, you're actually causing yourself problems with interoperability down the line. So that is something we have to bear in mind. And, you know, the certificates, of course, need to be provided to us, and we create SVG content from them. So if you refer to the Gather Requirements main page, and you see there is a link that takes you to GitHub, and these are zips that contain the inputs for each country. So they can download these zips, and what they will find is one important templates to configure OpenCRVS that we've talked about here, about how to test it. So you'll see there is a testing zip. So these would contain example test cases that you can use to smoke test your configuration. And ones which are not described here, but really come into play when you're talking about real citizen data and real servers, which is how to monitor and maintain safely a running instance of OpenCRVS in the technical zip. So as a technical lead, Markus, it's very important that the technical zip files are read and shared with the right stakeholders, and that they understand the implications of monitoring and maintaining a live production instance of OpenCRVS. So when you download, now, if you want to, over time, with different releases of OpenCRVS, we may decide to iterate these templates. So the source files for these templates are in our Google Drive. If you search for _country implementation templates, you'll find the source files for these, and a README which explains what to do if you want to and need to make changes to these templates. Because we need to make sure everybody's aware of what the changes are, zips are made, and that on the wiki, the zips are refreshed with the most up-to-date content. Because these are obviously public. So everything in this folder is public will be public. So we need to make sure there's never anything in here which is project specifics, always generic. So let's take a look at the inputs, and these are the files which we share with countries. And you'll notice that they are exactly the same sorts of CSV format that you see in our docs for configuration of an instance. So, for example, administrative structure, we can see all of these templates have a guide tab. This is how you complete it. And a template of this is actually the data that you'll put in. So what these inputs are is it's templates that can be handed to a developer so that the developer can then complete the installation section 4.2. So that's the purpose of these inputs, is that they are source files for development teams who can then configure the system. So at the end of the day, you'd have this Excel sheet ready to be downloaded as a CSV and imported as the locations to use for address hierarchy. So you can see every single one of these will map to a technical task involved in configuration for a country. So you probably recognize some of these terms, and there's lots of other YouTube videos on each one explaining in detail how to configure them for each country. One of the most interesting ones is the declaration of forms template. So as an example, here is the Somalia declaration forms template. So here we can see this is a guide to a designer and developer about what fields to put in the form for each section, and a quality assurance engineer to make sure that the fields have been put in correctly. We can see that there's the label for the input, what the translation might be in different languages, and what type of input it should be, and what options should be available if it's a select, etc. Are the fields mandatory or optional? And the developer can use this as a guide to configure the form. And this is precisely what should be up to date for Madagascar when Tamid or yourself are actually making configuration changes for births and deaths, marriages, etc. So these are kind of defined right at the beginning of a proof of concept project. The country would say, oh, we asked this question, then we asked that question. Usually they would supply a paper version of the form and say, this is what we do currently on paper, and this is how we should translate it to work in a digital scenario. Now, there's a lot of background knowledge within the team about the fact that names and dates of birth, sex, place of residence, and place of birth are not customizable. There are very good reasons why we have created them the way we've created them. And if you look at the core code birth indexed TX file, where you can see the TypeScript, you can see comments saying required field, required field, required field. And usually we do not customize those. It's possible to do so, but we try to direct the country not to, because, as I said before, it could break interoperability. Whenever there's a field which we have already created, which isn't necessarily mandatory, but does map to a specific property in FHIR for interoperability, the FHIR standard, we call that an optional field. And you'll see that there's optional fields in the as well. So you'll see like mandatory or default fields and optional fields. And usually before we make any custom field, we should check that there isn't a mandatory or optional field already available for that question, because the value of input will go into a specific property in Fire for interoperability purposes for those types of fields. Anything custom doesn't go into anything specific in Fire. It goes into what's called a Fire questionnaire. A Fire questionnaire is a standard for asking any other random question that you want to ask. But by its very nature, we don't know what kind of question can be asked. Therefore, custom questions require custom interoperability if they need to be interoperable. So that is why we tend to direct countries to use the default fields before making custom field, if one exists. Because the custom fields, as you can see, we won't know much about them from an interoperability perspective. There'll be no standards here. It's just a random questionnaire about here you go. Basically, a question, which is a text, and an answer, which can be one of these data types: Boolean, integer, etc. So that's kind of the inputs for a configuration. Before I move on to talk about the next stuff in the technical folder, which is not around inputs, do you have any questions about inputs for any of these projects that you'd like to ask?
Yeah, maybe just to clarify to myself. So imagine I go through all the inputs and I have those filled, then I should actually have a working product to set up. I have all the roles, locations, the form. Now I'm ready for the next step.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah, perfect.
The inputs should be exhaustive for any country to be able to complete section 4.2.
Yeah, makes sense. Then we can go to the next step.
Great. So the next step is, of course, all about provisioning infrastructure. And a lot of this is related to having a robust installation that will cope with scale and be secure. And you're in the middle of doing this right now. So for example, you're talking about all of the requirements of a country to have the right kind of data center, to appreciate that they need all these different environments for quality assurance, backup, staging, a mirror of production. And we've got other videos where we talk all about what these environments are for, the requirements for VPN, etc. And requirements for load balancing at population scale, that they'll need to be server clusters for different population sizes. So you can work with the country to let them know, okay, maybe you're starting off a pilot in these districts which has these populations, and you'll be fine for a while with one production server. But when you get to have more than, say, you're covering a population of at least 1 million or above, you're going to need to have more production servers, because you'll have many staff members using the system at once, and you'll need some load balancing. So there is a let's take a look at the technical documents. So inside here, you can see a network diagram. We generally tend to share this with countries and say, this is what an OpenCRVS production installation can look like. And you can see the fact that all the servers need to have outbound internet connectivity, so they can access things like an SMTP or SMS gateway, which could be in the cloud, or the avatar images, which come from an API, or Google fonts. You know, if the servers don't have outbound internet, then they can't get these assets. But that inbound is denied, other than through the VPN, so that nobody can access the servers. Now, obviously, we share this with the country, saying this is the ideal, and the country will decide if it wants to take all these security steps or not. So from our security point of view, we make recommendations using the best practices that we are aware of at any given moment. We have a memorandum of understanding with the country, which will say, you know, we're not really liable for whatever decision you make, because the country may decide for very good reasons, with its own capacity and cost considered, to not take these recommendations or do things slightly differently. You know, we are just need to be able to let the project managers and countries know that the country's infrastructure team has decided not to do this, and then that is a implication that the country will have to manage themselves. We're not responsible for those decisions at all. So you don't need to worry that that's something that, if a country decides not to take up to do some of this, it's not on us, really. It's the country's decision to make. We're just giving the best advice that we can give. And we tend to help the country provision a QA server. We will demonstrate that. You know, here's how you can deploy to a test server. All of the secrets that are created, we show them where they're created and how they need to be added to a password manager. And we usually don't have access to the country password manager, but we can, you know, send the secrets for a QA server to a country, and they can paste them into the password manager that they control. And then we ask the countries to independently set up production and staging servers and backup servers where actual citizen data is going to be stored. And we might watch them do that on a video and give them advice. Sorry, a video call, and give them advice, help them with any, if they don't type the commands in correctly. But our policy is that we don't access any live production server or staging server or backup server ourselves, so that we're not we can't mistakenly affect any real data. It's not our concern as an OpenCRVS Core team. Other documents you'll see is this one called ongoing costs, and this is just pointing out to the country that, of course, there are some costs associated with some companion tooling that needs to be set up. So Slack, if they want to use that as a messaging alerting system to receive alerts in the server, they obviously need to set up their own Slack. Or it could be Microsoft Teams or something else where they can receive alerts, and that obviously has a cost. They don't have to use Slack, they can use something else, but these are example costs. You know, costs for a GitHub organization, costs for a password manager, a bug tracking system. At the moment, OpenCRVS is hard-coded to use Docker Hub. It's hard-coded to use GitHub Actions. We don't have the team size to currently change that or allow that to be configurable. We'd like to one day, but maybe in the future, not right now. So there are options in the Ansible scripts to use things like Pingdom, or Papertrail, where system logs can get stored in the cloud. Can be helpful for some countries if they want to, or if they have servers crashing regularly and no way to be notified. They can use Pingdom for that sort of notification. When a server goes down, they can get a message and they can investigate if there's something irretrievable, system logs and Papertrail. But these are optional for a country. So next, we can see environments and users' credentials. So in here, you can see what we don't want to have is ever any kind of document that says these are all the staff members, because such a document could be used for social engineering if it was ever shared or printed off or left on a train. You'd have the contact details for all the staff members, and then you could contact them and you could say, try to get out of them their passwords, etc. But at the same time, we need a way to project manage that the users that are required have been created in production in order to start the pilot. And we need to know the potential IP addresses of servers, and so that there's some evidence left behind for future staff who may join the project. Staff may leave, and there needs to be a handover to know where to find all this stuff. So that's what the environments tab is for. It's really for writing down IP addresses, who looks after the hosting. Because often it could be a third-party company, like a telco, or what are the URLs to the environments. And I'm going to talk about the QA users first. So here you can see what this tab is for quality assurance engineers. As we know, we create fake users in the default employees CSV. Default. I think it's called default employees.csv. And that is really actually just quality assurance testing users that can be used in a QA environment. And often we use like a email alias so that all the emails go to the same inbox. And the usernames will be designed appropriate to the country, so it feels real in a proof of concept, but they're not real people. So this is the only file that actually contains information about test users, and we don't mind to have such a file public because it's never used for real. These are fake people. But if you're saying to the client and a lot of QA engineers access to this URL, these are the user details, it's a pain for us to have to do that on an individual basis. Better if we have a document everyone can refer to, and they know, okay, I can find that user access details here. The production user, you'll notice there's no place for a password in this file, and there should only ever be one user in this document. That is the National System Administrator, the most important user of OpenCRVS. We want to make sure that that user knows their power to create all other users in the system, what their office is, what their email address is, and to ensure that they have made a very strong password Our usual password, you'll notice when you use the tool, we work on low resource settings. Most of the registration staff, we're only enforcing, I think, a 12-character long password with an uppercase character and a number at the moment. The National System Administrator, that's not acceptable. They need to have a very long passphrase. So normally, when you create that user in the prod employees CSV, you'll create a password for first login, and that goes on GitHub, right? And then you tell them immediately, log into production and change your password to something very uncrackable. Could be a passphrase, and immediately put that passphrase in a password manager. Then you can mark this as complete. And now you know the National System Administrator account is secure. And then they will independently make all the other users.
So then would this be the point where is the last possibility to put the GitHub repository as a private? So before you do this step?
Oh yes, it must always be private. The GitHub repo, country config repo, is always a private repo. Mm-hmm. Then you'll notice this one called the I'm going to go to the pre-deployment checklist, first of all. Looks like there's a new one in draft that we're working on. This is a checklist that before we go live in country, we need to make sure that our Riku and Nico have quality assured the whatever infrastructure we provision. So it doesn't matter who it is, we want to get a second opinion. So if Riku does it, he'll get Nico to do it. If I do it, I'll get Riku and Nico to do it. Just to make sure they go through all this checklist to make sure that the production servers, staging servers are all ready for citizen data. So it's pretty self-explanatory to read, just making sure that the alerts are all being received properly, that there's nothing in the terminal logs, they've all been cleared. In case anybody ever SSH'd in, they would be able to see anything, any commands that we've used in provisioning, etc. And then these documents we share with the stakeholders. So whoever is the project manager in country needs to get a copy of these. Monitoring and maintaining OpenCRVS. This is making sure they can track, where their copies of files are for, again, ensuring that a project can be handed over between internal staff in a country. Where is the pre-deployment checklist for that country? It should be in their document management system, not our Google Drive, but a private location for them. Likewise, ongoing costs, the user's file. It can't be on our Google Drive. It needs to be somewhere that they store, because we don't want to have in the OpenCRVS Core team any docs left over that are private to a country. I'll come back to the data security framework document in a moment. But there is a monitoring and maintenance tasks that the country needs to be comfortable with being able to do themselves over time, such as they understand how to upgrade from one version to another, and they can keep track of what OpenCRVS version is currently deployed in country in this table. They can add extra rows when new versions are created. Ubuntu needs to be kept up to date. Any Ubuntu dependencies need to be kept up to date. The country should have their own plan for regular penetration testing of their configuration, which they probably want to perform once a year, at least, in order to ensure that they are keeping the dependencies up to date for any zero-day vulnerabilities that have happened that year. Or maybe they might want to do this more often. It's really up to the country. And there is a monitoring and maintenance checklist which should be shared with them. And it helps them, for example, you can customize this for a country, depending on what SSL certificate they decided to use. How often does it need to be refreshed? And are they upgrading Ubuntu? Is somebody on point to do that once a year? Now, these columns, obviously there can be bugs in any system. We don't pretend that OpenCRVS is bug-free, but they have Slack in place to catch Sentry alerts. So if the alerts happen, an issue needs to be created to fix whatever Sentry bug comes in their own GitHub project. So at the moment, Madagascar, I think, has a GitHub project unique to Madagascar, and they need to know that when a Sentry alert issue is raised, they should make an issue in their own backlog. And they can liaise with us as Tier 4 support to say, OpenCRVS, we've received a Sentry error. Have you received that before? Can you fix it? Yes, we fix it. It's available in the next release. And they can track their own resolution linked to an upgrade of an official release. But also they will have their own user configuration issues. So their own staff will encounter questions or which maybe they need to make an issue for, bugs. Their own staff have encountered something. What's the solution for it? Is it just a different way of working? Or is it in fact a bug in OpenCRVS that needs to be fixed? So we want to make sure that they're aware that it's their responsibility to monitor and maintain their own instance from a bugs perspective or staff question perspective. And there may be issues required to be created in OpenCRVS Core for some fixes. We don't know. So it's really up to the country to decide how often monitoring and maintenance should occur, how often these checks should occur. I've got them here on a weekly basis. I don't see any reason why it can't be done on a weekly basis, that these can be updated by which person, by which date, any notes. And this is a project management tool for countries to make sure that their system is being kept up to date. They can ask technical teams to show them these documents. And if they're not completed, then they know nobody's actually keeping an eye on OpenCRVS in production, which they really should be. So that is basically saying, make sure this checklist is kept up to date and that somebody is asked to do so. And an example of the kinds of checks an explanation of each of these checks. Here you can see what a Sentry error looks like and how to make a bug. Etc. And the alerts that come through from Kibana. Okay, so then there's a final explanation about what it's like in general to upgrade a version of OpenCRVS, just guidance on that process. So the final document is the Data Security Framework document. It's very important that this is shared before we go live with the main stakeholders, non-technical stakeholders. The technical people were kind of aware of all the ways in which we can be attacked to some degree. But this basically explains that what are the implications of having a digital system, that you can have social engineering. It can occur. People can try to access your server registration system. They can try to, pretend to be OpenCRVS. Because we're an open source project. Anybody can look at our code, think, okay, I'm going to mimic OpenCRVS, and I'm going to email staff members and pretend to be OpenCRVS and get their login details. So it's very, very important that countries take the responsibility to train their staff on data security. If you get an email from OpenCRVS, make sure you look at that URL and make sure it is the right link you're clicking on before you're logging in, making sure you're looking at the padlocks, the SSL certificate, etc. Make sure you're using a password manager. Make sure you're not using the same password for OpenCRVS that you use for your email account or anything else that you, despite being in a low resource setting, there's no reason why you can't adopt things like multi-factor authentication on your email account to secure it. So we're explaining about the need for training all staff, regardless of their technical capacity in data security. And we are documenting that an OpenCRVS project should be closed with we should no longer retain access to any files that any of the inputs that has been discussing. They should be moved onto a country-owned document management system. That the steps have been taken or not. This is down to them to decide what to do. And there are many links in an appendix for local security organizations that they can reach out to for training if they feel they're not able to do it themselves. They can reach out to these organizations and employ them to come and train them. So that is pretty much it. We've got 5 minutes left, but that is pretty much how we implement and the subjects explained. Do you have any questions on any of that?
I think it was quite comprehensive. All the remaining questions will pop up once one starts to provision the actual servers, I think. Absolutely.
Well, if you have any further questions on any of this, don't hesitate to reach out.
Definitely. Thank you.